My name is Dr. Christopher Schmitt. I'm a postdoctoral scholar in the Human Evolution Research Center here at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley, and I also teach as a lecturer in the Department of Integrative Biology. I came here to continue my research looking at the genomics of obesogenic growth in vervet monkeys, so I'm continuing that work here, but I also came here in part to teach the class Human Biological Variation in Integrative Biology, which is IB 35AC. So in this course, we kind of start out with the basics. We go over evolutionary biology. We talk about what different kinds of selection there are, what the evidence is. We talk about Darwin. We talk about the basics of genetics, because genetics is increasingly used as a tool to look at the history of populations in humans. And so we start from that kind of basic framework of what the biology is, and then from there we move on to understanding the specific biology of these certain societal identities, like racial categories. We go over the biology of skin color, like what it means biologically to have lighter skin versus darker skin, how it evolved, what the physiological mechanism is. We talk about differences in hair type and texture as well, what the biology is behind those, how they're not necessarily linked to other biological markers that we tend to associate with race. And from there we kind of leapfrog into other kind of societally or socially relevant physiological markers. So we talk about body type, and we have a whole section discussing the evolution of obesity and the biology of obesity and how certain social factors feed into that. We also talk about gender expression and sexual orientation and what we think is the biology behind those traits, and then how society interacts with questions about the fundamental aspects of these traits, like, are gay people born this way, and what does that mean for whether we should accept gay rights or not, and whether that's relevant to the discussion of the rights of people that have certain traits. And from there, we kind of keep going and talking about how biology informs the phenotype of certain people, how society interacts with that phenotype. And then we kind of come full circle and talk about how cultural perceptions of those phenotypes and how what culture does with that information can in turn influence those phenotypes further. So we know that there is a feedback between evolution and culture that goes both ways, and so we try to emphasize that in the class as well. As different human populations run into each other, all of this can kind of inform our understanding of where humans were when certain traits evolved that we now come to associate with race. And being able to kind of unite this research to get a better understanding of what race is and isn't from a biological perspective is extremely important, because in our history in the United States and also history across the world, people have used biology to kind of justify or excuse various levels of racism or discrimination against certain groups of people. And we even have a history of that within science. I mean, science, it is an objective pursuit, but that objectivity has in the past been tainted by the culture around it. So racial science, back in the early 1900s was very different from how we understand the biology of race today. People were categorized into somewhat arbitrary categories that were used in order to justify the treatment of those people by others in power. And it's very important for us to understand that history so that we don't repeat it. But also so that when we're looking at the biology and the science of race today, we don't make the same mistakes, so that we are aware of what possible prejudices we have going into our research. And also, it's important to teach this so that people can receive this information critically, because we still today, in popular media stories and the news, going around even on campus, just having conversations in dorms, people have these same kind of prejudices with misinformed biological ideas of how races are different. And so this class part of the project of this class is to break those misconceptions down and give the students a really clear idea of what biology can and cannot say with respect to how different people look and interact with the world. I mean, the audience for this class is pretty varied. In the class right now, we've got 300 students. It's pretty big. And I asked at the beginning of the class, and we've got a good mix. Like, there are a lot of freshmen. It is an introductory course. So I think that upperclassmen might find the first section of the course somewhat repetitive when we're talking about evolution and genetics, and kind of getting everybody caught up to speed with the biological background they need in order to discuss the biology of these characteristics like we do later in the course. But I think that actually it caters to a really broad audience, because once that kind of background is established for those that may not have experience with it, then we can use that background and build on that to actually discuss the research that's been done on all of these characteristics, and discuss also how culture kind of mediates and intervenes with these characters to make meaning out of these biological traits within society. So we've got a number of students from the humanities majors, and we have students that are upperclassmen, and they do so I do keep it somewhat general. But I think that pretty much any major, or people of any age, we've also got advanced students in the class. I think all of them are getting something interesting out of the course. And I think that's kind of one of the beauties of the class, is that because we're discussing a topic that is just not often looked at in coursework, like talking about how race and biology intersect, I think that it's of interest for any number of majors at any experience level. Assignments are meant to kind of evoke the kind of thought that I want the students to have and the kind of engagement I want them to have in class. So we do have one major writing assignment in the course, and we do have students go through several drafts and discuss with each other what they're trying to say within those drafts in the discussion section. And this writing assignment is meant to be an engagement with a kind of popular culture discussion of how race and biology intersect. So one example of the kind of essay that I'll be asking students to engage with is discussing the anti-vaccine movement and how kind of the cultural narrative about vaccines has kind of butted heads with the actual scientific literature. Because so I'm not sure if you're aware, but there was one study at one point that was published that seemed to support a link between vaccines and autism. That study has since been repeatedly discredited and shown to be false. Many studies have been done since then that have shown that vaccines have no impact whatsoever on children insofar as autism is concerned. And yet we still have this cultural movement, especially in the Bay Area here, where people are not vaccinating their children. And this kind of cultural misunderstanding of the science is leading to real biological consequences, like people getting measles and mumps. And these have very serious ramifications. Measles has an R0 of 18, like one person can infect 18 other people. It's extremely infectious. And people who have been vaccinated can be infected even if they've been vaccinated. At a much lesser rate, yes, but if there's measles in the population, it can still be passed on. So really kind of severe consequences of this cultural misunderstanding. And so what we try to do is have students engage with these dialogues and be critical of them using the scientific literature, so that they actually can kind of start busting these myths around biology that are pervasive in our culture themselves, so that they can develop that skill and be critical from a biological perspective further on in their studies and in life.